welcome. I'm Eithne Treanor. Today, I'm in conversation with the director of the Global Energy Centre for the Atlantic Council. Randy Bell joins me now, and we're delighted that everybody is here. And as we look towards 2022, Randy, I know we wanted to see you in Abu Dhabi for the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Unfortunately, we're not going to join you, but I want to welcome you, and I do believe we're going to see you in Abu Dhabi shortly.
Eithne, thank you so much. I too was looking forward to seeing you and all of the Atlantic Council's friends in the UAE and the region, and all the people that we bring in for the annual Global Energy Forum, which is part of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Because of some of the uncertainty surrounding COVID and that huge caseloads that we're seeing here in the United States and in Europe and some other parts of the world, we've made the difficult decision to postpone the in-person Global Energy Forum to the end of March, so March 28th and 29th. We will be convening several virtual programs during Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week because we think that's such an important platform and really enjoy being part of it and want to be contributing to that crucial conversation. But we also think it's important to be bringing people into the UAE to be having these conversations in person. And so that's why we really took what was a very difficult decision to postpone until the end of March. But we look forward to being back in the UAE then, look forward to seeing you in person then.
It'll be great to see you. Indeed, it will. Let's talk a little bit about, we have so many things that we have to talk about, but when we think about Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, and indeed looking at the UAE, and really for, since I think 2008, sustainability has definitely been on the agenda here. But let's take a look at the pathways to net zero, particularly here in the GCC. And from your observation, where do you see the momentum picking up and what do they need to be doing?
Right. Well, the theme of the Global Energy Forum this year is pathways to net zero. And we were very, very clear that that was a plural, that there are multiple pathways to net zero. There's not just one. Net zero is a crucial goal for the world. We need to reach net zero by 2050 in order to prevent the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. However, there's not one single way to get there. There are multiple different ways that the world can get there. And in fact, every country and even cities and regions are going to be approaching net zero in different ways, depending on the resources they have available to them, depending on what the politics of the region or the city or the country, and depending on their level of development, where they are and what their energy system looks like right now. And so what we want to do is be very open to the different ways of reaching this goal. And it's really important that we set out the goal and not dictate the path to get there. Because as I said, there are so many different opportunities. Now, some places are going to go on a very, very heavily renewables focused pathway. And there are places where renewables are easy to deploy, they're cheap, there's lots of wind or lots of sun. The electricity system can be set up for that very easily with some storage and some clean baseload, perhaps hydrogen, perhaps gas with CCS, or perhaps nuclear. There are other places that are going to be far more hydrocarbon focused. And so when we think about hydrocarbons, we need to think about lowering the emissions footprint of those hydrocarbons. Now, the GCC area has some of the lowest emissions on a life cycle basis hydrocarbons in the world. So we see that as a really crucial part of the net zero pathway, is actually, as we're thinking about what the role of hydrocarbons is in the future, making sure those are some of the lowest emissions hydrocarbons that are available, but also then capturing the emissions, whether that's through carbon capture or converting those hydrocarbons into a low or zero emissions fuel like a hydrogen or a hydrogen carrier like ammonia. So we see hydrogen as playing a really important role in many different net zero pathways.
And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, because there is a big focus on hydrogen here in the UAE and indeed in many countries around the world. But are you encouraged with, I suppose, the shift in the narrative that has, I think, really happened, I suppose, in the last 5 years and is really escalating now. And we're hearing it from the private sector, from the international energy companies who used to once be the international oil companies. There's a lot going on in terms of the new focus. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. The net zero conversation has been building for a while. As you say, for the past 5 years, there's been a change, and we've seen it gradually. And it was a conversation about energy transition. It was a conversation about meeting climate challenges. Really, in the past year or 18 months, it's become, I think, a much more focused conversation about net zero. And that's really positive because it's a recognition that it's not zero. It's net zero. That's a crucial pragmatic approach, but it's also far more focused. It's far more setting a goal instead of saying that we have to transition, which is a bit amorphous. It really is saying what the end state needs to look like in order to meet these goals. And then you have this buy-in from governments, from the private sector, as you say, and even from energy companies, where they're playing a really important role in driving the net zero conversation. And that's something that's happening much faster than I think many observers would have predicted 2 years ago, before COVID. Really, that's hugely positive. I think it's also important that this remains a very deeply pragmatic conversation, and that you have these multiple parties involved in the conversation. Again, the governments you have, and governments are crucial. It's not just coming from activists, but it's coming from governments who need to balance multiple political constituencies. So they recognize the need to keep energy prices low. They recognize the need to meet these climate challenges. They recognize the need to adapt to climate change much faster, as we're seeing these climate impacts already. So a government can sit above those conversations and actually think strategically. The companies making these investments, so you're seeing technology change very quickly. You're seeing the flow of money, the flow of capital move in different directions, which is very, very exciting. You're seeing deployment of new technologies at a rate that was, again, probably couldn't have predicted a few years ago. So I think the momentum is really all positive in the right direction.
I mean, it is a very dynamic time, I think, when we have these conversations, and we look at the amount of conferences and, many virtual conferences we've all been at, but we're hearing this from so many people. And again, I think everybody's looking for clearer policies, but also I think there's a need for people to grasp the fact that the timeline is not going to be perhaps as quick as some people might have thought or might wish. The infrastructure is not there to actually just do an overnight shift to, renewable economy. And again, there is importance to be placed, I think, on reducing emissions, whereby this is a tough message, I think, for some of the energy companies to sell, but they're doing their best. And as you said, even here in the region, we're looking at low emission fuel. This is a start, and it's something I think that's going to help us along that way. What do you think?
Right. This is an energy transition or an energy transformation. It's not an energy revolution in that it can't happen overnight. As you say, it doesn't happen like this. We're talking about net zero by 2050. We're not talking about net zero by the end of 2022. That's simply not possible. As we're seeing, the consumption of energy post-COVID is going up. And so we really need to be thinking pragmatically about how do we get to this net zero by 2050 goal while making sure that we don't undermine economic growth, that we maintain political support by keeping energy prices low, by focusing on the demand side, so that we provide the technologies and make it an easy choice for consumers, for companies, and for countries to meet these goals. So absolutely, this is a process. It's going to be bumpy. We can work to make it less bumpy if we can cooperate, if we can be strategic, but it's not something that just can happen tomorrow.
And again, I think we all have to keep in mind energy poverty that still exists in so many parts of the world. And I think bringing energy to the people who don't have energy at the moment, that then creates extra demand. So in many ways, there's a lot of people not even being counted in the mix right now. Many countries, particularly in Africa, in Asia, in developing countries, yes, talking again about coming on board and doing their best when it comes to contribute. But actually, they'll be very happy to have access to really to any kind of fuel at the moment. That's a tough one to actually make sure that when the demands are out there on countries, on governments, that, and I've heard it from many ministers in African states as well, that there really shouldn't be judged, I think, on the same basis. That's what they're saying. They're going to have maybe a more difficult time. What do you think?
So I think on the one hand, that's absolutely right, that the developing countries produce such a minuscule percentage of global emissions, both currently and historically, that it's not the right, from a sort of ethical perspective, they shouldn't be bearing the costs and the burdens of climate action. However, I do think that there's a real opportunity in certain countries to leapfrog. We have to be careful about that metaphor. It's not the same as the mobile telephony revolution, but there are real opportunities with the price of renewables so cheap right now, with new hydrogen technology coming online, that there are real opportunities for countries that are rethinking, that are building an energy system that is far less developed, to build it for the future instead of for the past. And so I want to encourage both international development agencies and companies that are working on this, and also governments, to be forward-looking and make sure that they're not building the energy system of 2022 or 2021 or 2020 or 2015, something in the past, but really looking towards the future. And so I think about a country like Namibia, which is looking really far down the line. They have great wind resources, great solar resources. They're thinking about the role that hydrogen can play, and producing green hydrogen, both for domestic consumption, for regional consumption, so to South Africa, but then also as an export. And so they can produce, build renewable projects, provide power for their citizens, and then also have hydrogen as a backup fuel for when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, and also then have an export market. So that solution isn't going to work everywhere. Again, this is why we think about pathways to net zero, but it's a solution that I think really needs to be considered as an option when it makes sense. Building large-scale renewables projects is a possibility, and it has great development opportunities right off the bat, particularly for countries that do not have a hydrocarbon resource endowment. That's a really fantastic opportunity, and companies like Mazda are already thinking like that.
Now, you talk about hydrogen, particularly there, but I mean, we've talked about hydrogen, and I did want to come on to this because it's something that here in the UAE, there's been huge investment and commitment been made, and everybody looking towards hydrogen as, one of the fuels of the future. But let's just, look at hydrogen by itself, hydrogen and ammonia, and indeed the colors of hydrogen. Talk to us a little bit. I mean, I think everybody's gearing towards green, but along the way, are other colors acceptable, do you think? And is the investment in other hydrogen worthwhile as we go to green?
Yeah, so I have written on this topic, and I guess it was last year now. My colleague David Yellen and I published a paper on the colors of hydrogen, and our argument was we should not be thinking about the color, but or which is a sort of signatory for as a symbol for how the hydrogen is produced, but think about the life cycle emissions of that hydrogen. What we're really focused on is emissions. So yes, there's been lots of focus on green hydrogen, which is hydrogen produced from renewable power through electrolysis. But there's other types of hydrogen. There's hydrogen that can be, there's the current, most hydrogen now is so-called gray hydrogen produced from steam methane reforming. If you put carbon capture on top of that steam methane reforming process, it's called blue hydrogen. So just the basic math suggests that in the short to medium term, we're not going to be able to produce enough green hydrogen to meet demand. And so the effort should be, again, to meet hydrogen demand in a low to zero emissions pathway. And so that means thinking about blue hydrogen as an opportunity, thinking about hydrogen produced from nuclear, which is sometimes called pink hydrogen, thinking about pyrolysis as another option. So thinking about it doesn't so much matter how the hydrogen is produced. It's emissions and where it goes. And frankly, and this is something that's I think a little bit harder to swallow, but the math suggests as much, and we always try to be sort of technology agnostic and going where the evidence takes us, is that even gray hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from natural gas, used in certain circumstances, particularly heavy trucking, can have an immediate greenhouse gas emissions benefit based as compared to diesel, and then a huge local air quality benefit, and that creates a pathway for blue and green hydrogen as well. So there's some opportunities for hydrogen switching, even in a higher emissions hydrogen, that really need to be considered. On the blue hydrogen, I really do think it's important to talk about some of the pitfalls that need to be managed, or else it won't work from an emissions perspective. Which is, if you're talking about producing hydrogen from natural gas, you need with carbon capture, there are two caveats, two things that need to be managed, which is first the methane emissions across the value chain. So from the well to the point at which to the steam methane reforming, so the pipeline or whatnot where it's transported, the methane emissions, the fugitive methane emissions need to be managed, and that need to be absolutely minimized. That is doable. It's frankly cost effective to do that, and frankly, if you're thinking strategically about this, you probably can place your steam methane reformer near to the well, and so you really even minimize the opportunity for leaks. And then the second is the carbon capture, and making sure that there's a very high percentage of that CO2 that's actually captured. That, again, doable. There needs to be more work done on that, but if you get those two things right, you really will get a low carbon hydrogen that will help decarbonize many industries that otherwise would be a challenge.
One of the big challenges about this too, I think, has been the cost. And particularly, I've been talking about carbon capture and storage for probably about 15 years now. We've been to see some plants in many areas as well. Do you think that carbon capture and storage and usage, that its day has actually come now? And I think we're beginning to see more applications in many, many regions, and even here in the UAE. Do you think this is where there's going to be a lot more focus? And again, let's look at the costs of hydrogen as well.
Right. So, of course, hydrogen produced from natural gas without carbon capture is going to be cheaper than with carbon capture, simply because you're adding additional step and additional process. However, if there is a carbon market, which we are seeing in growing in Europe, the price on carbon in Europe is much higher than it used to be. There are incentives in the United States that effectively put a price on carbon in a carbon capture setting, the 45Q tax credit. So if there is a price on that carbon, then you're starting to see the prices equal out, and actually it become cheaper to produce hydrogen with carbon capture, or use carbon capture in a power setting. Now that will the technology, of course, as it's deployed, the price will come down. That's what always happens, and so you'll see prices come down. Now there also is there are conversations about using the CO2 as a product. Once you can get to the carbon as a product, then it's a very different type of conversation, because then you're actually not storing waste, but you have a product. That day has not yet come, but the need for carbon capture has never been more clear. If you look at any number of net zero scenarios, there is a role for carbon capture, and frankly, direct air capture as well. It depends on which scenario you're looking at, how much they focus on it. It really depends on, again, if we think about it, it's a regional or country level decision. There are some countries and regions that have great carbon capture storage geological opportunities, others that don't. And so you need to think through those opportunities at a sort of country or region level. But but absolutely the time is now for more carbon capture, more investment in carbon capture, and for thinking about carbon, and the price and the what it means when there is a price on that carbon.
A lot of people are calling for that, an international, a global price on carbon. That's probably a long way off, but a lot of people actually see that will, almost put an end to the arguments in many ways. That if we're all looking at price of carbon, then therefore people will make more, practical decisions and think about this. Do you think we're ever going to see that? I mean, I think we're seeing it in some areas.
Well,
do we need to see it?
That's the crystal ball. That's hard to say. Getting any sort of big international agreement is a real challenge. You see lots of conversations about carbon clubs, about border carbon adjustment, so taxes that affect imports that are have a high embodied carbon content. And so well, I think it's much bigger challenge to have a sort of formal international agreement about a price on carbon. But I do think that you will start to see implicit prices on carbon on specific products, not every product, that are being driven by, for instance, the European CBAM, which appears to be going forward. There's, it's starting with a few products, and then they'll talk about expanding, et cetera. So you'll start to see mechanisms that put an international price on carbon, even if there's not a formal international agreement. Now, those have got to be compliant with WTO, et cetera. There are ways of doing that that work. There are proposals out there that I don't think are compliant with WTO, but you'll see. I do think over the next decade you will start to see these ways of pricing carbon internationally, that do fall short of sort of an international agreement on a total price.
Now, when listening to you, you're very much in favor of bringing down emissions. Basically, it really is about getting emissions out of fuel, and that's almost the first step. We're seeing a big argument in Europe at the moment, particularly in looking towards nuclear and looking towards gas, in terms of that there should be almost any credit given to the fact that companies are doing this. Talk to me a bit about nuclear, because we're seeing growth in nuclear in some regions, and then we're seeing other regions saying no more nuclear. Where do you see the future of nuclear?
Yeah. So first, there is a robust existing fleet of nuclear power plants, and those should not be shut down unless they are really at the end of their life cycle, their useful life. We're finding that we can extend nuclear power plants' useful life up to 80 years in the United States, at least. Unless there are real significant risks, or they're really at the end of their life, nuclear has some of the highest capacity factor of clean energy of all power sources. So shutting down a perfectly good nuclear power plant, whether that's done in the United States, which we've seen some, or in Germany, where they just did some just recently, you immediately have an increase in emissions. So number one, whether you want to see new nuclear or not, you just need to keep that power on the grid while we build out whatever else you want on the grid. Now, I'm also very optimistic about the future of nuclear, and frankly, the need for nuclear. It's not going to be everywhere. It requires a pretty sophisticated regulatory environment. It requires a relatively large grid, particularly with the sort of large Generation 3, Generation 3 plus, Gen 4, larger plants. Now, the small modular reactors and the micro reactors might be able to work in countries with smaller grids, where they can absorb that level of power. But I think that if you look at just any of the grid studies, getting renewables as entirely renewables electricity system, really challenging. The costs start going up, the management starts going up. You need lots of transmission, which is very, very hard. And then there are, like what we saw in Europe in August, there are times when the wind does not blow, and you need to be able to manage that. And so nuclear is a great opportunity. Now, there's some places that have hydro or geothermal that can use those resources instead of nuclear, but not everybody has that opportunity. So I think we need to be really open-minded to nuclear, and the advanced nuclear technologies that are starting to come online, that are starting to get deployed, really are remarkable, both from a safety perspective, a proliferation perspective, but also they're really good. Some of these technologies are really good at balancing renewables, following load, and really managing the variability of renewables. And so it can actually be empower a more renewables electricity system. So I'm very bullish on the future of nuclear. And I think the final piece on that is that there was a recent UN study that showed that on a life cycle basis, nuclear power is the lowest carbon power source. And if we really care about emissions, which is what I care about, then we really should be thinking about nuclear as a fantastic way of lowering those emissions, because it really is a low emissions technology.
And in many ways, it's quite sad that all of the great advances in science when it comes to nuclear, that the world we're not hearing as much about it perhaps as we should when it comes to the media. Managing that message, and I think we look at many countries where we see nuclear power, and we look at it in France and in Russia, in areas like in Europe, and even here in the United Arab Emirates, a strong regulatory framework, and also I think managed very, very well. What can the industry do? And also I suppose when it comes to hydrocarbons, but there's a real need, I think, to have a better and a stronger message out there, particularly as the big energy transition goes on, because we have to deal with what we've got in place at the moment. And it's about, as you say, reducing emissions, but keeping the lights on at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, the industry, and I think the UAE is a great example, the industry can just continue to deliver on nuclear's promise, and can work with climate activists to show them that nuclear is a low carbon technology. And you're starting to see those changes. Not all environmental activists are pro-nuclear, but you're starting to see those changes and continuing to demonstrate the valuable role that nuclear plays in the low carbon energy system of the future. I think is crucial. Continuing to develop these new products, continuing to innovate. That's, I think, where the future of nuclear is from the private sector, from the company's perspective. Governments have a different role, which is to create a regulatory environment that is conducive to building new nuclear plants. Not, of course, minimizing any safety concerns, but really want a regulatory environment that allows for the build of new nuclear plants by including nuclear as part of any low carbon energy package, and also valuing nuclear for the attributes that it provides, which are not just clean power, but baseload power, high reliability, the ability to produce high temperature heat, which can go into district heating or can be used for high temperature electrolysis for hydrogen. There's just a lot of opportunities that, if the regulatory environment from the electricity and energy side were set right, you could really take advantage of the multiple benefits of nuclear power.
Now, when we think of the work of the Energy Council, it's indeed very, very wide. But we first of all probably think about geopolitics and indeed energy security within there. Looking at the role the Middle East and the GCC has played over the years. I mean, this has certainly been, I suppose, in many ways, the center of energy security for so many other countries. When you look now, and particularly when we look at the change and the dynamics and what's happening around the world, where do you see the role of the GCC now when it comes to energy security?
Well, first, I think that the recent energy price spike that we've seen over the past few months has shown that the old energy security paradigm has not gone away, that the continued reliable supply of hydrocarbons is crucial for the global economy, and that governments are going to pay attention to that. And so the GCC, as a major supplier of oil and natural gas, working, and it's OPEC and OPEC plus partners, though that concern continues to be relevant, and frankly will continue to be relevant until we see a time when oil and gas demand is in rapid decline, and we're just not seeing that. And even when oil and gas demand or oil demand is in decline, you'll still see huge relevance, because you'll need to make sure that there are not price spikes as assets get stranded, as investment goes down, et cetera. So there's going to be a really important role for GCC countries to play in continuing to produce hydrocarbons over the course of the energy transition. Now, look, the energy transition, even in the most aggressive scenarios, still has a significant role for hydrocarbons out to 2050. And so we're going to continue to see hydrocarbons produced. And so the GCC is most likely going to be one of those important producers and to have a really crucial role in managing that market. So that's important. But also, you're seeing that there's huge energy expertise in GCC countries, and that goes beyond hydrocarbons, and that's going to be crucial for meeting energy demand in a low carbon world. And so you see investments in nuclear in the UAE. You see renewables. You see hydrogen across the region, and these and it's a great opportunity to produce clean hydrogen in the region and export it to places like regions like Europe, which really won't have the capacity to produce enough hydrogen to meet its projected demand. And so there's going to be a continued relevance for the energy expertise and capabilities of the GCC in ensuring robust supplies of both traditional energy as well as low carbon energy going forward.
Now, the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week is, yes, taking place in the UAE, but it paints a global picture and really puts the spotlight on sustainability around the world. But bringing it back here to home and looking at Abu Dhabi and looking at, the work that the UAE ministry and everybody is putting in place here, the diversification of energy that's happening here. There's probably not one source that we don't have in many ways. So it's, again, a very dynamic industry here at the moment. But when you look at Abu Dhabi and you look here in the UAE, you've come to visit quite often. Where do you see that need, and indeed probably the great results that we're seeing from taking a step back and really deciding that the energy mix is going to be diverse?
Yeah. So just as an example of how impressive the UAE's thinking is, and really it's not just thinking, it's action. The Atlantic Council has led a U.S. Congressional Staff delegation to the UAE twice. We were planning on a third one until COVID prevented that. We'll do one again in the future, just to get the Congressional Staff out of their comfort zones, whether they're on the right or on the left, which is a bipartisan group, and have them think bigger about energy. And we bring staff to, we brought staff to Baraka, we've brought staff to Masdar, we've brought staff to ADNOC. We've really shown how a country like the UAE can have a strategy and think through a diverse set of energy needs and priorities. And people walk away recognizing, of course, the UAE is going to continue to produce oil. It's low carbon oil. They already are using CO2 that's captured from a steel facility in EOR, which lowers the emissions footprint of the country. So they're able to think, to the congressional staffers that we bring are able to sort of see this as this sort of systematic way of looking at energy. And that's just hugely impressive. And it lets people recognize that this is a transition, that it's not one or the other. The diversity of supply is crucial, both just to meet energy, global energy needs, but also for energy security going forward, and to make sure that this transition is as orderly as it can be. So when I come to Abu Dhabi next, which again it will be in March, we will continue. Really look forward to seeing those changes. That again, I haven't been to Abu Dhabi since the end of 2019. So I'm really looking forward to seeing just the changes over 2 years. That the sort of an ambitious energy strategy can bring.
Let's take a look into the future too. We'll see you in March, but we'll also be seeing you, hopefully more of you in this region too. COP in Glasgow last year, of course, was the big focus for the world. We're going to now see COP coming to this region here, to Egypt and then to the UAE. How important is it that perhaps there's a shift in focus? I mean, of course, it'll be a global look at what's going on in the world, but without a doubt, it's coming to a different part of the world that we've seen at COP before.
Right. I think it's remarkable that 2 years in a row, the COP will be in the MENA region, Egypt and then Abu Dhabi. That's a really fantastic opportunity to highlight the value that the region brings to the global economy, and to put a spotlight on some of the really important changes that we're seeing in the region. Egypt is a major gas producer, and gas, of course, has been one of the biggest drivers of emissions reductions globally by displacing coal in the power sector. And so we can actually talk about gas and the role of gas in the energy transition in a way that is harder in countries where the politics really don't allow that. And so we can have a much more robust and pragmatic conversation about how we actually get from where we are right now to where we need to be. I think it also is a great opportunity to highlight the importance of low carbon, low emissions oil, where the UAE is a leader, and also talk about nuclear, and also talk about carbon capture, and also talk about hydrogen, all of the various technologies and energy solutions that the UAE is developing. The great thing about the UAE is that it's set its goal as emissions, and is not tied to any single technology as the only path forward. And so that really will be a more inclusive conversation in Egypt and in the UAE, because it allows for those types of conversations that have been previously perhaps a bit of a challenge.
Now we're going to miss the voices from the Atlantic Council, as part of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. But when we look at all of the topics for Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, I mean, all of what you're talking about, there really is great diversity there. And again, from people from around the world. Are you looking forward to making sure that you're keeping an eye on what we're doing during Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week?
Right. Well, we will actually be programming virtually during Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. So we'll make sure that we are there, if not in person, through the joys of Zoom and Teams and whatnot. And so we will be part of it. We wouldn't miss it, and we're really glad that we can do that virtually. And some of the things that we'll be talking about during Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, will be doing our annual sort of year scene setting panel. So really looking at the range of energy issues for the year. That's one of the great advantages of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week being in January, is that you can look back at the year prior and talk about what the priorities are for the year ahead. So we'll be doing that. We'll be talking about the various pathways to net zero. So some of the things we talked about here, we will be talking about hydrogen, and of course we will be talking about energy security. You can't avoid the energy security conversation, and when you want to talk about climate, because if you don't get the energy security piece right, you will not get the climate piece right. So we'll be having those conversations during Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Then when we're in person in March, we'll be expanding on that, but some deeper dives on ESG, on nature-based solutions, on carbon capture, again, work on hydrogen, a crucial conversation that needs to continue. We'll look at the role of oil in the energy transition, the role of gas in meeting energy needs and in meeting climate needs. And also we will be looking ahead to COP27 and COP28, and what the climate agenda looks like coming out of Glasgow, what we need to accomplish this year, next year, and beyond, in order to meet to meet these net zero goals, while also ensuring that everyone has access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy.
Indeed, so it's we're starting off the first quarter, with Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week, and we'll be almost closing out the first quarter then with the in-person Atlantic Council. And of course, in the meantime, we'll make sure that everybody is kept in touch from both. So thank you so much for being with us, Randy Bell, the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. So it's great to have you here. Thank you, Randy.
Eithne, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in person later this year.
We really look forward to it. And of course, to all of you at home, to make sure that you're joining us for Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. Register and join us, of course, at www.adsw.ae, and make sure to register to come in person. We'll certainly have lots of people here, but of course, we'll make sure that virtually you're kept in tune and that you're kept engaged and informed right throughout the time. So that's it for me and from Randy Bell. Thank you so much.